Hey, what's up? Welcome to Life Inner Show. I'm your host, Jason Wojo. On the Life Inner Show, we help people make more, work less, and live awesome, amazing, abundant lives. I am joined by my co-host, Polish Peter. What's up, brother?
Hey, man. Good to be here today. You didn't pause before you were starting to say something about me. So,
dude, you know what?
I don't get more and more clever.
I'm going to save it. I'm going to save it for another episode where I'm going to think of something super witty and clever to say that's going to be just like super funny and insightful. But it wasn't.
Or you just
today.
gave up on the whole funny thing.
That's the other possibility I gave up.
It just doesn't work for me. I just forget it.
Right. Well, listen, man. Our topic today is anything but funny. It's a heavy topic. It's off the beaten path of what Life in Air typically talks about and covers. But here's why, Peter, you and I discussed this. This is an important episode, we believe. Mm-hmm. Now, with that being said, it is a very heavy subject. It is something that perhaps you as a listener have dealt with personally, either because you were the person who did what we're about to talk about, or you were affected by it. Peter and I are both, we have personal history with this. And what I'm referring to is in this episode, we're going to talk to Mike Lee, who was a pastor of a large church, a mega church for over 40 years. And he had a moral failure. He had an affair. And while, but let me clarify something here. Peter and I didn't have affairs. Okay. That's not us, but we've been affected by it in our family. And so you may be wondering why we're going to talk about this. And it's because, number one, people struggle with this, but we're going to talk about it from a perspective. And by the way, this is one of the most hurtful things I think that someone can go through, to suffer through. And so, and please don't take this in any way that we're covering this to condone in any way what went down, what occurred. However, I also feel there's a really valuable and multiple valuable lessons in here as it relates to screwing up in life in general, right? Yeah. As it relates to messing up, right?
Yeah. So, I want you guys to listen from the perspective of curiosity. For a moment, there's set aside what the actual thing happened, because it is, I had to do that myself. I think Vojo had to do that himself at some point, set aside what actually happened, and to listen from the place of curiosity and wonder what it's like, on both sides and what you can learn out of this, right? Because I believe in every single breakdown, in every single moment where there is something that's tough happens, we go through a valley when the crap hits the fan kind of a thing. There's some kind of a breakthrough that can come out of this in every single situation, I think. So what would be the breakthrough there? What would be the thing that you can learn out of this, take out of this, that's going to be beneficial to you in person in life?
Right. And just to add to that, man, in the episode, Mike talks about the consequences of something like this. And there's a lot of consequences. Oh, yeah. But the reason why we want you to listen to this is because, and by the way, you might have already tuned out because you're thinking gosh, he's a pastor and he had this happen. And man, those Christians, this, that, though. Let me just encourage you to stop right there, right? Because that's judgment. And by the way, there is biblical scripture that says the leaders will be held to a higher standard, and that's not what we're talking about here. But what we're talking about is God's not necessarily done with you if you've screwed up in life.
Yep.
And I want you to listen to this from the human side of things rather than a judgment side of things, and see if there's something that you can learn from this. See if there's something that we can uncover. Some of the topics that Mike discussed and that we discussed really, it convicted me in a certain way. Gosh, am I being judgmental? Am I loving on the unlovable? Am I accepting of people? And so I think there's some really gold in here if you can really let yourself open up and be open to that.
Right on.
All right, let's do it. Here's our interview with Mike Lee. Hey, Mike, what's up? Welcome to the Life in Our Show.
Jason, good to see you this morning.
You too, my friend. Listen, so I'm really excited to dive into something that I feel is very important. And it regards a book you've recently written that has been inspired by some of your life events that have recently transpired. The book is called Death by Church, Life Through Christ. And tell me what inspired you to write this book. And before we get into the contents, I feel like it's important to set the framework for people so they understand where the inspiration for this work came from.
Well, Jason, as you know, I was a minister, pastor of churches for 40 years. And after 40 years, I had a moral failure. And as a result, my life kind of came crashing down. Um, it's one of those situations where everybody says that would never happen to me. 100% felt that would never happen to me. But it did. It did. And it was a very large church and it was very visible and everybody knew about it. And so um, I went through an incredible time of, like anybody else, depression, alienation, discouragement, dark thoughts I never thought I would have as an individual. And one of the things I realized in this process as I began to meet people and run into people was a lot of times they had a negative experience as how the church had addressed the crisis of their life. And it became apparent to me, having pastored, I guess at that time, one of the 50 largest churches in America, is that churches, we do a really, really good job of celebrating redemption stories if no one's ever been a part of the family. If you're a drug addict, a prostitute, if you've been in prison, and then you come to Christ, man, we'll celebrate you. We'll make a video about your story. We'll interview you. We'll do all kinds of things. And I think we kind of see that as a feather in our cap. But I realized when I took my story into account and talking to a lot of people, when you're already in the family and you fall, you don't necessarily get extended the same grace and mercy and kindness. And I met a lot of people who were like, well, I went to church, I was involved in church, and my parents went in church, and this happened, and this is how the church handled it. And I've never been back in the doors of a church, or I've kind of walked away from my faith. And I began to realize just how much reliance we put on the church itself, which is run by human beings, versus that personal relationship with God. Because I pastored, I think, one of the greatest churches in America, but there is no perfect church. I've always said, if you find a perfect church, don't join it because you're going to mess it up. And so there is no perfect church. But what I learned in this process is there's a lot that we all can learn how we can more effectively represent Christ on this earth. I mean, if Jesus said, I didn't come for those who are healthy, I came for those who needed a physician, then think of us as a hospital. How can we be better prepared, whether you're coming in from the outside or you're already on the inside, to be nursed back to strength and health and redemption through the process? And so that's kind of what the book was born out of.
Well, so I read the book, and by the way, Mike, I've known you for, I think I started on the worship team at Hope in 2014-ish or so. And I've been going prior to that. And so I was in the midst of everything going on and kind of caught in the middle of seeing everything unfold. And as I read your book, I'll tell you, it struck something in me that I didn't realize was there, in that I had a real, some epiphanies on some of the things you wrote when you talk about that. And I want you to unpack this word. So you've shared some of this on social media as well, how like these dark times that you struggled with, and judgment, and there's nowhere you could turn, and isolation, and all these things. But then there's a book word you use in the book called uncondemnable. And that really struck me, because even as Christians, I feel like we are prone to this, to condemning each other to some extent, even despite we know, and you reminded us of the lessons in the book. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's amazing. Paul says in Romans 8:1, therefore there's now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And it's interesting, chapter breaks aren't inspired. They were put there by the translators. And chapter 7 is where Paul's having that, maybe his own crisis. These things I want to do, I don't do. The things I shouldn't be doing, I do. Wretched man that I am, who's going to set me free? And I don't think there should be a chapter. I think the very next thought was, oh, right, that's right. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Why am I beating myself up? That's how God sees us. That's our position. Positionally, we are perfect. That's not how Christians treat one another. One thing I've learned through this, and it's interesting, when the book came out, I didn't even have the copies of the book yet, and I knew that no one had them, but people were going on the page reviewing it, and it really wasn't a review. It was an opportunity to just really plow into me for what I had done. One of the things I had to keep, and this was tough, was that from God's perspective, he doesn't love me any less today than he did before this happened. And there's nothing, I'm in Christ, I'm a new creature, and there's nothing I could do that's going to drive a wedge between the love he has for me and our relationship. Now, are there consequences? Absolutely. If he loves you, he chastens you, he disciplines you. But it doesn't change the relationship. But we're so used to all of our earthly relationships being conditional. Like, if I treat you a certain way, you're going to treat me back. And, we live more like do unto others before they do unto you, or as they do unto you. But God just loves us unconditionally. And once we're in Christ, there is no condemnation. I taught that my whole life, Jason, but I don't know that I ever needed it. And in this process, it's like, wow. I mean, yeah, I couldn't believe it. I could not wrap my head around it because I'm picking up my vibes from everybody else. So it's like, man, I feel condemnable. I told a funny story in the book. It's maybe funny now, but it wasn't then. But I was working at a restaurant. A friend of mine I've known for years said, you need to do something to get out of this apartment you're living in. So invited me. I don't know what I am there. I guess I'm a goodwill ambassador, but I just say hi to people and kiss babies and ask them how their meal is. And but I walked in one night and I walked up to a couple and I didn't know them, but it was a younger couple with older couple that I later found out was the young lady's parents. And I went up and I said, how was your dinner? And her response was, oh, Mom and Dad, this is the pastor that committed adultery and destroyed our church. And it's like, whoa. I mean, those are the kind of things that were taking like several tables around us. They just turned and looked. And you realize that's a lot of what I'm going to have to deal with. And you just wanted to disappear is what you wanted to do. But there's really nowhere to go. So it maybe the first time in my life, I had to not just believe it, but grasp to the truth that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And again, consequences are consequences, and that just comes with it, and you have to work through those. But I wonder how many people have been hurt by the church, or they haven't been treated or in a certain way, or something did happen in their life, and because of how the church responded, they walked away from their faith, and they've never gone back. I think there's probably a lot of casualties. And so that's a lot of what led me to write this. There were 4 or 5 guys who, honestly, I wasn't that close to. They're younger than me, but for some reason they attached themselves to me, and they made it very clear they didn't condone what I did or approve in any way of what I did. But yet at the same time, they were like, there's no way you're walking through this by yourself. And they incorporated me. I mean, they had young kids. They incorporated me in their family. I hate to play golf, but they invited me to play golf all the time. They would bug me just to get me out of my apartment. If you don't come to our house and watch football, we're coming there. And literally, and this is what's interesting, they were ostracized by so many Christian friends because they were kind of like, we're going to accept you and love you where you are. And we're not going to let you walk through this alone. And it's just interesting to see all the dynamics, what we present publicly in our ministries and in our relationships. But when the crap really hits the fan, how things seem to play out. It was an interesting experience.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, having lived out that leadership. Well, Jason, our mission statement was love people where they are. Yeah. And encourage them to be like Jesus. We probably do a pretty good job of encouraging the Jesus part, but truly loving people where they are. I just met with a guy at 6:00 this morning, and his story of how he was treated after something came out it breaks your heart. I mean, he's a 60-year-old guy just in tears. He's never been back. And there's a lot of people. I've always said it's probably amazing, when you take the story of the prodigal son, how the father's waiting. He's just waiting and waiting. He's looking every day. How many prodigals would return if they knew they were going to be accepted? And in fact, they used to say, if you were the first person the prodigal met when they came back, would they stay or would they just turn around and leave? And I just think I think for Christians, we have to, come to terms of how much we really believe that we're to love unconditionally as we've been loved unconditionally, and we're to be accepted unconditionally as we've been accepted, and we're to forgive unconditionally as we've been forgiven unconditionally. We love to say those things, but to actually live them out, I would say we got a long way to go.
Well, Mike, so when you told the story of the prodigal son in your book, it struck me from a different perspective. And I imagined for a moment, well, first of all, that son was still a son before they left, and then they left and came back. And then by analogy, somebody who's a quote unquote Christian, who's in the church and then goes off the rails, isn't always welcome back because of, of whatever, whether it's like, they're judged, you should have known better, whatever the justification is.
You're all true. Should have known better, right?
But at the same time that it comes back to, and you bring this up as well in the book. It says, Jesus loved us when we were when unlovable. We were not acceptable. We were not okay in the state we're in. There was nothing worthy about us at all, and yet it was extended to us. And so if we were to model Jesus, that same exact perspective and acceptance and love and, and all of these things have to be also applicable in this situation. And I think your situation, I think, brings this to the forefront because you were the leader. And so this is the moment that, I want to be careful how I say this, but this happening has challenged it's challenged them. Do I really believe this? Am I going to live this way? Am I going to live not in judgment? And am I going to love people no matter what? It's easy to forgive somebody who's, they've been a Christian for 3 months and they go off the rails. But like, if you really believe this, it should be applicable to everyone.
And I understand that James says teachers are going to be held to a higher standard, and we should be 100%. But it's hard when people say, but you taught this, but you did this. I go back to Peter. I will never deny you. I will die for you. Oh, I never knew him. It's just like, no, I mean, I know that we're held to a higher standard and we should be, but we're not infallible. And as I was sharing with Peter, I probably for the last 5 years, I probably should have resigned and moved on. I saw the cracks. I had lost the joy. But you don't know how to get out. You don't know how to get out. And it's interesting. When I went to counseling, I went away for 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks. And the counselor asked me like the third day, he said, do you think you intentionally self-destructed? Because it was the only way you could get out. And I didn't really know how to answer that question. I don't know how you answer that question, but, but but I will tell you this, I know we're held to a higher standard, but at the same time, it seemed like people were angry because it's amazing how people can make everything more about them. And so it was about the inconvenience I had caused them. This was the church they loved to go to because they love me. And look what I did. I ruined their life because I went and did what I did. And not much like, man, how can we help you? It was more like, you just need to know how angry we are at you because you messed up everything. So those are the kind of things that you just, I don't know that you're ever prepared for, but you just try to figure out how to get through them.
And so, the two things that I wanted to say is like, one is like, what would you say to somebody having experienced what you've experienced now? Like, but before someone condemns another person or judges them, What's something you'd like to kind of say to them or get them to think about prior to kind of just jump, because I think that's an emotional reaction, right? They're angry, they're bitter, they're feeling like a sense of loss, whatever that is. Like if you could just pull them aside and talk to them, like what would you say?
I'm guessing that that's part of the healing process. You got to get it off your chest kind of mentality. But everybody knows, if they believe what Jesus taught at all, if you hang on to the anger and the bitterness and the inability to forgive, you're just throwing your own life in neutral, probably reverse. And Jesus says, if you don't forgive, you'll be turned over to the torturers. You're just torturing yourself. And so the other thing I would encourage people, and this is just kind of a fallacy of mega churches. You can't pastor a mega church without people putting you on a pedestal. No matter how much you try to tell them, don't put me on a pedestal. But it's interesting. The very middle verse of the Bible is, man will fail you, God will never fail you. And I didn't want to fail anybody, and neither did I think I ever would. But I don't know. I've always said judging is Christian's favorite indoor sport. And I guess it just makes us feel better about ourselves. And if we're not processing that anger, it's going to come out somewhere. I think some people have an innate ability to forgive and move on. I always felt like God gave me a gift. And maybe he doesn't give it to everybody, but I've heard a lot of stuff in my years, a lot of heartache and stories. And I always felt like God gave me the ability. If you were in my office and you just gave me your darkest secret, when I saw you on Sunday, I didn't see you through that lens. I just saw you as somebody that's, man, he's really going up against it right now. He's really going through it. So I think some people just are maybe born with the natural empathy. But I also know that if you're truly aware of what you're capable of outside of Christ, it probably keeps you a little bit less judgmental. So I don't know.
So one thing you said is like, I never thought it happened to me. I never thought it would be me. I think everybody feels that way. Like nobody goes into a marriage thinking they're going to be unfaithful. Nobody goes into a job thinking that they're going to end up, doing something unscrupulous or stealing or whatever. What do you think? Is there anything that can diminish that, or when you look back, were there things you mentioned, like, you being pushed pretty hard in the church and seeing the cracks in your foundation, and everything? Do you feel like those are the things people have to look out for, like before if they're going down a slope? Like, how can people, is there a way for people to kind of catch themselves? Or if this is just us, we're broken, we're human, we're going to do this stuff?
No, I think we obviously see the cracks ourselves. And I think sometimes we think we can patch them up, we'll get through it, or we can't afford not to continue forward. And that's kind of the trap I felt that I was in. So when I did realize, in fact, I just woke up one morning, I'm like, man, I'm broken. There's just something broken. My emotions were just like, my emotional tank was empty. I didn't feel anything. And so when I asked the board for a sabbatical, I think looking back, I'm hoping they would say, I wish we would have responded differently, but they didn't. One person texted me the next day, say, hey, if you ever need to grab a cup of coffee. And so once I kind of put my heart out there, and that was it, I'm going to plow through. And then we went into COVID and speaking to empty auditoriums and not seeing people. It just made it darker and darker. I would encourage people in leadership to realize we all have the potential if we get broken enough. And lots of times leaders like me, we're kind of old school. I joked one time that sabbaticals were for millennials. The rest of us, that's not how my generation, you just work. Okay, they said no sabbatical, work. I think we have to be more sensitive that I don't know that anybody understands the pressure that that you're under when you're in a position like a pastoring a mega church. Doesn't excuse anything. Don't get me wrong. But I was telling somebody one time, I said, I had a deadline every week. Like if you don't finish your work on Friday, you'll pick it up on Monday. I had a deadline every week, and I had thousands of people that were expecting me to bring something that was going to be somewhat impactful in their life. And that's a lot of pressure. And not only that, you get a church, an organization where you have 180, 200 staff who expect to have salaries and health care, and you're living in a crazy culture, and you're trying not to say anything that's going to offend everybody and split the church or run people off. And now, oh no, what do I do with all these families that expect a paycheck? And you're living with that pressure. And I don't think I was wired to handle it. I had been telling one of the guys on staff who I consider to be my Jonathan, like, I don't think God wired me to pastor a big church. But what I should have had the courage to do is walk away. And there's a lot of factors I won't get into today as to why I didn't. And I look back and 100% wish it had not gone this way, obviously. But I don't think the end result would have been me staying in my church, nor the ability to salvage the marriage.
Right. So as I was going through your book, there's something struck me is that, as you were talking about the shame and the guilt associated with this, and it struck me as like when somebody goes through something similar to this, you have three areas I feel that need to be somehow dealt with, or I'm not sure if reconciled is the right word, but like you have your relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And that's number one. Number two is like your relationship with yourself. Like, do you forgive yourself? How, all the internal things going on, and then the external things. That'd be the third one. So like the community, the people around you. How have you dealt with each of these, and like, how are you doing with it now?
The counseling helped a great deal, but it didn't solve everything. It gave me a different way of think, ponder, see myself, but that doesn't get fixed overnight. So that's just the journey. As far as the damage of the relational chaos, I said I had a few friends that have stayed very close to me. I had a small group that I started attending of guys I didn't know. That was helpful because I could be not Mike, the mega church pastor, just Mike. That was helpful. This book was never intended to be a book. It's just, I started journaling, and I had just read the story about David being run out of Jerusalem by Absalom, and the fact that there was no good way for this to end. And it was, I used to tell people all the time in counseling, sometimes it's just the new norm. If you go through a divorce, if you lose a spouse, a child, it's the new norm. It's not going to get fixed. It's just the new norm you've got to adapt to. And so I try to remember that. But when I started writing, not long after that, I was working at the restaurant one night, and the owner of the restaurant and another gentleman who happened to be there, a Christian guy, they said, "Mike, what you still have something to offer. And that was the hardest thing, because from where I sat, I thought the only way I'd ever have anything to offer again was if I could put all of this back together. That was my value. Well, when I realized none of that was going to happen, these guys said, why don't you teach a Bible study? And initially they said, maybe we can get some of the staff from the restaurant to come. But they said, we'll come. And I said, okay. So I think the first week we had like 7. And since I never got to make a statement to the church asking for forgiveness, that was the first time I'd been in front of a group. And I took the opportunity to do that. I said, I need to share this with someone. This is what I did. Consequences are consequences. I wanted to say it out loud, and I wanted to ask forgiveness from someone. And they were so sweet. It was a very emotional morning, but afterwards they said, can we just get around you and pray? And they prayed. And that felt like there was some release. Like, that's the best I can do I didn't want to go on social media and make a statement. Everything I do gets reworded and dissected. And so I thought, I can't do anything about that. I just got to move forward. And so I started teaching this Bible study, and just some people started showing up whose lives are as broken as mine. And it gave me a sense that, one, God wasn't finished with me yet. It was going to look different. And I didn't have any desire necessarily. I don't have any desire to pastor a church again. But it was a sense that I can hold down 3 or 4 or 5 jobs and do all kinds of things, but there's still a gift that God gave me, and there's a place for it. And it's just the new norm. I'm remarried now. Didn't think I would be at this place in life, but it's the new norm. And you know what? In ways, I have experienced the faithfulness of God like I didn't even know possible. And it's not the big kind of stories that make great videos. It's just the little things along the way. And so that's been a lot of it.
Got it. Okay. So listen, Mike, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Okay, I got a question for you, because we're getting to the end of the podcast here. So I just want to ask this question because I think it will be important. Someone who's going through a tough time, like they go through like crap at the fan, life kind of got turned upside down, going through a dark valley, whatever it might be, that particular person, like where you were at. What would you say to them when they're going through that time?
One is God's not finished with you yet. I mean, we would not have a Bible. You go all the way back to Abraham in Genesis. God's just not finished with you yet. He took all kinds of train wrecks and turned them into incredible things. I just was teaching the story of Rahab last week. And I used to, we used to talk about John 13, as Jesus said, this is a new covenant in my blood. And we would say, well, this new covenant, it's not about the law, it's about grace and mercy and forgiveness and love. You can't read and study the Old Testament. This has changed my whole perspective on the Bible, unless you can see it through the lens of grace. I mean, you take Rahab the harlot, a harlot, which by God's law, she should have been stoned to death to start with. But not only that, she wasn't a Jew. She was a Canaanite, who were the enemies of Israel, as they were supposed to be running all the Canaanites out of the promised land. Yet because of her faith, it says she lived among the Israelites to this day. So God, what that told me was God's grace and mercy and forgiveness is not overshadowed by his law and his judgment. Even then, God was saying, I'm going to take a prostitute who should be stoned to death by my own law, and I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to put her in the lineage of Jesus. In fact, she's going to be the 31st great-grandmother of Jesus. And if you can't see God's grace through stories like that, those are the real redemption stories. And so you either believe that God's the God of the Bible who can still do that, that he still has a plan. And it may not be the plan, like I said with David, it may not be the plan. It may not be the way you thought it was going to be, maybe better. But God still has a plan. I think my word would be more for those who have people in their lives that are struggling. Galatians 6, verse 1, when it says restore, literally the Greek word is get up under and carry the burden with them. It doesn't say judge. It doesn't say stonewall. It doesn't say isolate. It says restore. And I think the key question when someone is struggling, going through a situation like this, is what can I do for you today? Can I come sit with you? Do you need me to pray with you? You need to grab some lunch to get out of the apartment? What can I do for you today? And that's going to make more difference. One of the things I wrote in the book, and I've said before, you'll never influence anyone who doesn't feel accepted by you. The minute someone feels rejected by you, you've lost any opportunity to impact their lives in a positive way. But if you can make people realize, I don't condone what you did, and I don't approve of what you did, but that doesn't mean I don't accept you as a creature of God. And I'm here to come alongside of you and help you carry the burden. If we could just get to that place, I think our relationships would drastically change.
Mike, I got to tell you, this has been really, really profound and beneficial. And I think people come to this from two different sides of the coin. One is they themselves have stumbled, and they are the ones who are dealing with, persecution, judgment, not being accepted anymore, ostracism, whatever. And then the other side is people who have, who are either, actually there's three sides. The middle side is the person who's doing the judging, right? And so I think your stories help people kind of reconsider how they view sin, in that, first of all, it's something we all do. And, my sin is no better or worse than your sin. And we all struggle, no matter who you are, no matter what your position, we're all still in the same boat. And then the third perspective is for people who have somebody in their lives that's going through something like that, where they now have the ability to come, what you're saying, like come alongside them, love them, support them, and encourage them. And so I really greatly appreciate you sharing with our folks and talking openly and candidly about your experience. And I know it's going to change some hearts, and eventually I think this is the kind of things that helps people and Christians recalibrate a little bit towards their hearts and their relationship with Christ.
Well, and that's why I wrote the book, Jason. And I know this is a chance to sell a book, but when I sent it to the publisher in California and he read it and he called me literally and said, any Christian that has an ounce of humility will want to read this book, because this is an area where every one of us as believers could use some growth. And I hate to be the catalyst, whatever, behind that. But I think we could all grow. And I know our churches could grow in this area. So,
and repeat the name of the book again for folks and where they can find it.
It's Death by Church, Life Through Christ. And then the subtitle's Hope for the Hopeless.
Love it. Thank you, Mike.
All right, Jace. Thank you. Peter, nice meeting you. Thank you, bud. You guys have a great one.
Can you imagine what that must have been like to have that level of exposure in the community, and then this kind of fall from grace in the eyes of a lot of Christians and locals, and then to have to kind of work your way back to to that relationship, not only with God and realizing that we're here unconditionally accepted and unconditionally loved, and then yet at the same time kind of undergoing like the things that go along with that. I mean, you talked about the shame, the guilt, the isolation, like all of it, the judgment. That seems like a really hard place to be in, man. And I can't even imagine what that's like. Because, I think pastors especially, they're viewed as like, holier than thou. Like, when you're a pastor, you're supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to be above everybody. And so when you fall, I think there are some people that probably, celebrate that because they like to see, Christians screw up. And then another, like you said, some people are really angry at him and he's dealing with his own stuff. And then, so it's just such an emotionally charged issue for people. But what struck me and what he wrote in the book that really struck with me is like, God and Jesus loved us when we weren't worthy. We were we weren't, nowhere near being worthy of unconditional love. And so it strikes me that when somebody screws up, and by the way, when I read the book, I was confronted with myself, like, because I realized, I'm not the person like throwing the rocks necessarily, but maybe I was on the sidelines watching people throw rocks. You know what I mean? Like, those biblical stories of like, and I wasn't throwing the rocks, but I probably didn't do anything about it, and so it just made me, it stirred something in me that made me realize I need to love more unconditionally. I need to be more accepting. I need to be less judging. And this thing that happened with Mike, just, I hope it, in a strange way, I hope it is used for good so that other people see this in themselves as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough conversation because, I mean, think about it. Out of the Bible, it talks about how God loves us unconditionally. That to me means there is literally no conditions. He's got no condition of what I need to do or be or whatever needs to happen in order for him to love me. And when I look at that from that perspective, and I look at how, I interact in life and how we were doing stuff, we humans, and how many of us are capable or are having this love, unconditional love, not only maybe for other people, but for ourselves. Think about it. If we loved ourselves unconditionally like he loves us, would life be a little bit different? Would we have less suicides? Would we have less, divorces? Would we have less, whatever you want to, talk about? Yeah. I think there would be a lot of different, look how someone goes into addictions, right? Do they love themselves unconditionally? Probably not.
Well, man, and so I think to love yourself unconditionally no matter what happens, and to love yourself unconditionally no matter how much you screw up. Because listen, Christian, not Christian, whatever your denominational belief is, you're going to screw up. We're all going to screw up. And to not get on yourself incessantly that you can't ever get past that is not serving anybody, so that same unconditional love that God has for us, like, we need to show that to everyone, including ourselves and other people around us, and he said himself, like, my life will never be the same. Like the path that I expected to be on, retiring from a church and having taught for 40, plus years, and that's gone. It's gone, but there's still something for him. And if you're somebody who, life hasn't turned out the way you thought it would, and maybe you're divorced, right? Or maybe whatever life looks like, I think it doesn't mean life's over. It means that the path has changed, and God hasn't forsaken you. He hasn't given up on you. He's still there for you, no matter what.
Well, I mean, he said it at one point during this episode about the fact that something along the lines of, if you're still alive, God hasn't done with you. He's still got a plan for you. So if you just look from that perspective, think about it, then there's got to be something else here. Yeah. If I'm still here walking and breathing, then he's still not done with me here. So that means there's something bigger than me, something more to come. There. Right.
Yeah. And so I think, along with that is like, I think we have to be careful as people not to judge others who have made mistakes. And this can be tough, dude. Like, especially if you've been hurt, if you've been hurt personally by somebody, and to not judge, and we've said this before in Life in Our Show, like, people make decisions, like, and they make the best choices they can in the moment based on the information they have and based on their circumstances and based on their conditions. And so whatever that is, like, if you're under a time of stress or duress, people misstep, and so, we might have people, we might have listeners that judge us for featuring Mike on the show, because of what he did, and think that we're condoning this or somehow we're justifying it. Like, that's not the case at all. Like, and Mike said this as well. He knows it's not right, and he knows it's wrong. And we're in agreement with that. Like, there's no, we're not excusing it, right. But I don't think that gives us the reason to stop loving on someone. You know what I mean? And so, like, for instance, like, and this is where, for instance, like, think of the prodigal son who returned, and the father opens him welcomes with open arms, like so excited. But I think the thing that struck me about the prodigal son story is like, imagine, and this makes me think about this too, and this is extrapolating a little bit, but like think of someone who's still prodigal, right? Like if you have a friend or a family member or someone in your life who's kind of still off the rails a little bit, they still need to be loved too. Like you don't wait until they've reformed themselves to love on them. Like imagine if Jesus did that with us. Like imagine if he waited till we were perfect. Like, dude, there is no day, right?
It's never gonna happen.
Yeah. Like, so I don't know, man. This episode really stirred up a lot of things for me, man.
It's a tough episode to go through because one of the things, like you just said, I mean, we all have different experiences, different way that we're interpreting life and how we go about doing it. And one thing I will say in regards to this, just got to get back. If you're a Christian, get back in the Bible and see what that says. How does that reflect? What does that say to kind of get back to the foundation, the grounding of, how I walk this life? You know what I mean? Because I will tell you this, from my experience with all the stuff that happened in my life, and my story and all that kind of stuff, I'm no better than anybody else.
Yeah, none of us are.
Like we talk in front of the room, and I don't believe I'm any better than any of the people that are sitting in a chair. Some are much better accent even than me. You know what I mean? Or no accent. They can understand what people are saying.
Right.
So, but it's totally, a tough situation, tough thing, and he's walking it, and he, there's a lot of healing that's going to come from that for him, for people who are involved, for people who were dealt with it, like, you yourself kind of a thing. And it's a process that it's going to come through. And I think ultimately God's going to get the glory, for what that's going to end up creating. Maybe something good's going to come out of it, I think.
Yeah. Yep. And so listen, again, we know this wasn't the typical message that we share, but I just felt like it was so important to have him on because we all have made mistakes. We've all lived prodigally. Is that, I'm not even sure if that's a word, by the way.
You just made it up, maybe. So it's all right. Yeah.
But like just what seeps through to me, the one thing that seeps through to me that I know I need to get better at in my life, and maybe you, the listeners, can relate to this as well, is like, am I loving unconditionally? Am I loving people where they are and encouraging them? And so that's the message of this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. Leave us a review, leave us a rating, leave us a comment. Get in the Life in Air private Facebook group if you want to be part of the conversation. If you want to comment on this episode, get in there too. We can talk about that too. And we will, as always, see you guys next week. Take care, everyone.